going to look at to model the reductions. And then we also, we had last year identified two super priorities, if you will, among the recommendations. That was accelerating solar development and accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the scope of work on one of those two, electric vehicles, during this discussion.
Great, thank you. We also want to acknowledge that on the co-chair's recommendation and by appointment from Secretary McElwain, we have a new member joining us today. So Professor Nate Holtman is with us. He's Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, filling a vacancy that we had on the Mitigation Working Group for a representative from an academic institution. So Nate, thank you for joining us. And can we ask you to take a minute or two just to introduce yourself to this group?
Sure. Thank you, Mark, and thanks to the co-chairs, and nice to meet everybody. I am, as Mark said, based at the University of Maryland as the director of the Center for Global Sustainability. It is an absolute delight to be able to work with this group, and I'm very excited about what we're trying to do in Maryland, and making our state, I think, an example state of how to do it right with respect to ambitious climate outcomes and good kinds of implementation toward those outcomes. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Looking forward to kind of getting to know you all through the process in the future. But for now, I know we have a big agenda, so I'm happy to move on with that. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Nate. And a big part of today's agenda is hearing from Nate's team. So he'll be implicated throughout today's presentation. I also want to start with a few updates from MDE. MDE recently published its Clean Air Progress Report, which I'll put a link to in the chat. It's fantastic, highlighting that Maryland's air is the cleanest ever measured, and that the state is, for the first time, measuring levels of air pollution that meet all of the federal health-based standards for 6 criteria air pollutants, including ground-level ozone and fine particulate matter. I encourage all of you to check it out. It's rare you get to read a report that literally helps you breathe easier, but this one does exactly that. Speaking of which, the US EPA announced its new power plant rule in Maryland on May 11th. We were honored to be the host state for this major federal announcement. The proposed rule would require the use of best available technologies, including carbon capture and storage and low carbon hydrogen, to significantly reduce power plant emissions by the end of the next decade. The rule would further improve air quality in Maryland, especially because some of the air that we breathe here blows in from neighboring states that don't yet have the same clean electricity goals that we have. On Monday this week, MDE shared its draft regulation for building energy performance standards with the public. Stakeholders have 3 weeks to review and provide written comments on the draft regulation. MDE intends to make necessary changes to the draft based on stakeholder feedback before issuing a proposed regulation in September. You can find the draft reg on MDE's website, and I can also share that link with you in the chat. In related news, MDE and MEA will be launching a Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force on June 29th. The task force is charged with recommending new funding programs to reduce emissions from the building sector, with a report due in December of this year. Task force members are in the process of being appointed. Meetings will be open to the public, and we intend to run several subgroups that will have open membership. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the task force. Finally, as you might remember from the April MWG meeting, we put a call out for ideas that MDE should consider as it develops the state's next GHG reduction plan. We received a number of ideas by the May 15th deadline. My team is reviewing those ideas now, and especially looking for new ideas that haven't already been vetted by the Climate Commission. All right, on to today's main event. A presentation from MDE's technical assistance partners at the Center for Global Sustainability, about their preliminary results of a policy scenario that achieves Maryland's goal of reducing statewide GHG emissions 60% by 2031. Over the past few months, the MWG has seen the development of CGS's current policy scenario, which shows how Maryland's on-the-books policies would decrease emissions over the next few decades. Today, we'll see CGS's Core Climate Solutions Now Act, or CSNA, policy scenario, which considers the type of new policies that may be needed to achieve Maryland's GHG reduction goals. To construct this scenario, we asked CGS to examine best practices in other states and the Climate Commission's recommendations for Maryland climate policy actions. CGS also used their sophisticated model to identify the most cost-effective and achievable pathway to hit the 60% reduction target. These modeling results are hot off the press and still being reviewed by MDE, so they are preliminary. MDE will be meeting with CGS over the coming days to help QA/QC the model. We'll say up front that you shouldn't put too much focus on the 2025 results as models like to move quickly toward outcomes, but do look at the results for 2030 and beyond as possible outcomes from the implementation of current plus new policies. We have 90 minutes on today's agenda to give CGS time to walk through their modeling results and for MWG members to ask questions. So without further ado, let me turn things over to, let's see, Dr. Kennedy with us today? Ah, there you are. So Dr. Kennedy, thank you for coming back to the MWG. I'm sure, as you know, the members here will have some excellent questions for you, but I'll turn it to you to walk through the presentation.
Thanks, Mark. All right, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. It's not letting me for some reason.
No.
Alicia, could you share the presentation?
I might need to give you permission. Sorry about that. Ah, cool. Thanks.
Okay, I think this is my screen.
Yeah, that's you, Alicia.
Slideshow.
Thanks. So today we're going to start with a brief project status update for the overall project, and then we'll go into the modeling results for our Climate Solutions Now Act compliant scenario. So we'll start with the modeled policies that we include in the scenario, and then go sector by sector to give you an overview of how those play out. And then we'll provide some summary results for the economy-wide emissions based on those sectors. And then we'll end with a look at the sensitivity scenarios that we're planning to include. Next slide. So first, our update. We do now have current policies fully included in the model, except for carbon sinks. We are planning to include those, but are still waiting on some numbers from a collaborator. But of course, sinks are not relevant for the 2031 goal of gross emissions anyways. So for the moment, we're just having them kept constant. Our CSNA scenario meets the 2031 goal of 60% gross emissions reductions. The 2045 goal is not quite there yet, but the June report will include a path to net zero. The June report will feature 2 core scenarios and 3 sensitivity scenarios. So there'll be the current policy and the CSNA scenarios in the core group. And the sensitivities will include low impact of the IRA as an estimate of low implementation overall, and then looking at net emissions accounting versus growth. So you will note that previously we had hoped to include some sectoral variation within the core policy set. And we found that as we actually reached the goal of 60%, any sectoral variation we could provide would be very minimal. So that's why you see we've narrowed it down to just a single core scenario for now, because those reductions just would not be super meaningful to provide a lot of variation there. The other update is on the impact side. So previously, we were not sure what level of granularity we'd be able to deliver for the air quality impacts. And we are able to say now we'll have the county level air quality improvements represented within the June report. So excited to be able to share that. We don't have results on that today, but did want to update you that that can be included in the report. Next slide. So here I'll turn it over to my colleague Alicia to talk about the modeling.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. So just a refresher of our methodology, we're using an integrated assessment model called the Global Change Analysis Model, and that has 32 global regions as well as the 50 state level resolution for the US. And the model runs in 5-year time steps. We have CO2 and energy consumption, as well as major sources of methane, nitrous oxide, and F gases at the state level. We also have electricity trade, as well as key inputs like GDP, population, technology assumptions, and they're all harmonized with the annual energy outlook. So diving into our current policy scenario, this we have shared here before, and these are just all the on the books policies that Maryland has currently, as well as current federal policies. So we have since updated most of the policies here. We're just waiting on the Tree Solutions Now Act for the forestry sector. But otherwise, we have things like RPS, RGGI. In the transport sector, we have ACC2 and ACT. We have Empower, the Building Energy Performance Standards for buildings and industry, as well as AIM-Act, natural gas methane regulations, HFC regulations, and landfill methane regulations incorporated. And again, just want to emphasize that these policies are implemented as they exist right now, the ones with asterisks next to them, and they're not the new rules or regulations that are being proposed. So in our CS&A scenario, which is where we have additional policies layered on top of the current policies, in the power sector, we have the RGGI cap being reduced to net zero by 2040, and we have clean electricity standards of 100% by 2035. In the transport sector, we have the Advanced Clean Fleets policy, which I can get into the details a bit more later, and some additional VMT reductions on top of the ACC2 and ACT that I just mentioned. For the building sector, we've incorporated zero emissions appliance standards, all electric construction standards, as well as strengthened energy efficiency standards. In the industry sector, we have Buy Clean standards that'll increase efficiency and electrification, fuel switching for the cement sector and other industry, as well as introducing cement CCS. For non-CO2s, we're using the EPA's marginal abatement cost curves for methane gas, waste, and agriculture. And we've also incorporated a cap and invest backstop in order to achieve the remaining reductions to get to 60%. We're also looking at incorporating 100% electric bus sales by 2025, but that is not in this run right now. So diving into the results, in our CS&A or policy scenario, we're hitting the economy-wide gross emissions target of 60% reductions by 2031. And in our current policy scenario, we're getting 50.9% reductions. The only thing that we are holding constant is the forestry and land use assumptions, since we're still waiting on a policy there. But otherwise, for the other sectors, we have all the necessary policies. So we're seeing the largest emissions reductions in the power sector, which is this dark blue color here, as well as the transport sector, which is right on top of the electricity sector. And you can see here that in our CS&A scenario, we're almost hitting our 2045 target of net zero with the introduction of direct air capture, but we're still refining those results so that we meet the target. And as such, we will be focusing on 2031 results today and looking at the concrete policies there. So just starting with the electricity sector, it gets about over 88% reductions by 2031, with fossil technologies being phased out and solar and wind coming in. And this chart shows you that by 2030 and 2035, the gas and imports are the main sources of reductions. Oil is very small, so you can barely see it. And then coal is basically phased out by 2025. We're getting a lot of imports here, so we're still refining this part of the modeling. But this, again, here, we're just including the key policies for RPS, planned coal retirements, IRA incentives, and we're also including the 100% clean electricity by 2035, with RGGI going to net zero by 2040. And for a bigger picture, here's the in-state generation. Again, the import behavior we're still working on, as well as the split between solar and wind. I think we're expecting more wind, so we need to work with the model settings a little more to have it come in. And for coal retirements, just to give you an idea of what our assumptions are, we're using the EIA, EPA, and Global Energy Monitor databases, as well as the announced retirements by coal companies in Maryland.
Alicia, did you say that you were assuming coal retirement by 2025 or 2035?
2025. So if you see here, there's no coal by 2025.
Okay, thanks.
And then, yeah, to mention, there's some gas CCS coming in by 2035. So just looking at the split between renewable technologies and zero or low emissions technologies, we're hitting the 2030 RPS goal of 50% by 2030, as well as the new policy of 100% clean electricity standard by 2035. And for the zero and low emissions sources, we're including solar, wind, hydro, gas CCS, nuclear, and biomass.
Alicia, I assume you are assuming the relicensing of Calvert Cliffs.
Yes, that is also assumed.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't explicitly mention it, but it is one of our
Gotcha. I see it now. Okay.
And just to take a look at the surrounding states where we would be importing electricity from, this is the generation mix for the PJM states. And we're also still refining these assumptions, but currently we have their RPS as well as emissions targets incorporated, and we're assuming accelerated coal retirements and then the RGGI cap of net zero by 2040. In the transport sector, we're getting 47% emissions reductions, and that's primarily through road vehicle electrification and efficiency. So we have the current policies here, which again, we're including the Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, IRA tax credits, as well as the infrastructure funding and CAFE efficiency standards. And then on top of that, in the current policy scenario, in the CSNA scenario, we're including advanced clean fleets, as well as some VMT reductions from mode switching and smart growth, which is consistent with what some of the leading states are doing in their plans. So yes, this dotted line is current policies, and then our CSNA scenario is what's shown in the graph here. And just to break down the EV sales assumptions, so for Advanced Clean Cars 2, we're assuming 15% EV sales by 2025, 54% by 2030, and then 100 by 2035. For Advanced Clean Trucks, depending on the type of truck, it's between 11 to 16% EV sales by 2025, 26 to 35% by 2030, and then 40 to 55% by 2035. And since the assumptions stop at 2035 for advanced clean trucks, in advanced clean fleets, we will get to 100% EV sales of freight trucks by 2045.
Let's see. couple of people with hands up. Yeah, Lewis, go ahead.
Yeah, on the previous slide, actually, the 11 to 15% on trucks, actually, the Advanced Clean Trucks rule doesn't start until model year 27 in Maryland. And so I just want to recognize that because you're projecting those sales on 2025, which is probably unrealistic. So
Sure, yeah, that's good to know. We can definitely modify it.
Thanks. There's also a question that came up in the chat about the VMT reduction estimates. I think it was maybe a slide ago.
Sure.
Are you able to say, I'm sorry, let me go back to the question. How much is the VMT reduction in this, or I guess another way of putting it, kind of, how did you formulate the assumptions around VMT reduction?
So we also cross-checked it with MDOT's assumptions for their policy scenario in the GGRA, and it's pretty close, but I think it's around, we're assuming a 1% additional VMT reduction from the current policy scenario.
Gotcha. Brian?
Hey, this is great. And I probably should have jumped in earlier because my questions are more oriented towards the power sector. But I'm just curious. So we see that the RPS requirements are met, including in-state requirements. Does the model produce shadow prices for, or I'm assuming it's represented as some kind of constraint that the model has to meet that in-state requirement? And I'm just curious about what the cost of meeting that requirement is. Like, is there a way to represent the sort of like an increasing cost curve for, incremental additions of new renewables within the state, which, would kind of in turn be a reflection of like having to site projects on more marginal land or further from transmission or that sort of thing? I guess I'm curious about how that's all represented.
I think there should be a way to look at costs. If Steve's on, maybe Steve can answer, but how we implemented this is we just set a minimum for all the renewable sources and the clean sources, and then the model just follows that by a certain time period.
And there is an implicit price, shadow price, that is how it does it. So we can take a look at that.
Okay, that's great. And then, so the model solves in 5-year increments. But for each of those increments, like what is the sort of like temporal resolution? Like, is it like sort of time buckets, or is it hourly, or how does it actually look at, the process of like, building supply and operating capacity such that like load is met and reserve margin requirements are respected, that kind of thing?
Yeah, this is, Alicia, this is the 4-segment version of the model?
Yes.
Yeah, so this version has 4 electric segments: base load, intermediate, peak, and sub-peak. And we do have a dispatch version that we plan to use for future analysis, because your question is very relevant. And so this model admittedly doesn't have high resolution on all those issues you're mentioning, but that is something that clearly we collectively need to look into more as we go forward.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I understand like having to look at it with maybe slightly less resolution, considering the fact that you're doing an economy-wide, very broad look. But yeah, if there are plans to dig in further, into the power sector segment of it, that would be great. Thanks.
And I see a question in the chat from Sona. Sona, do you want to just take to the mic and ask?
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I guess as we were looking into EVs, and that's the policy area we want to dive into the discussion, I just wanted to remind ourselves what's the percentage of new sales today as we think about the growth we have to go get. And then my second question was around the fleets. Is there any assumption, as that increasing penetration rate over each of the 5 years ties to like the fleets in Maryland? Do we have that data as to, you know, how many fleets will be making those decisions, those purchasing decisions of end of life and when they need to renew? Like, is that stock essentially available to hit these goals for these penetration rates, or is it just an assumed penetration rate? Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah. So I can start with your first question. We did look at the 2022 new sales for Maryland. I think it's about 6%. And we also looked at California's growth curve for EV sales, and we basically followed California to come up with a reasonable number by 2025 and to reach the 100% by 2035.
And we didn't, I'm not aware that our group has numbers on fleets in Maryland. That would be a good question for MDOT, or maybe someone else on the call knows, but I'm not aware that we had that in hand to look at, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Colby?
Yeah, I wanted to go back that since we're talking the trucks and things like that, that's obviously one that within the ag community we're watching closely, and particularly when you get into fleets and things like that. Based on the way that I've studying the clean trucks rule and the different things that's rolled out, that's more of a sales push on the backside of the sales side of it, not really a mandate on the current infrastructure to purchase clean trucks. And so from everything I'm hearing is that the number one impediment, I think it was actually I read an article today, is the number one impediment for light duty vehicles is that the charging infrastructure is nowhere near where it needs to be for people to feel comfortable that they can buy a fully electric vehicle and be able to charge it. And I know that's where the clean truck side is. And there's nothing in place other than some amendments that was put on the clean truck rule that requires a study and an assessment to be done. But I've never really seen anything of any kind of charge or push or some sort of policy to make sure infrastructure is in place, because I can guarantee you no one's going to buy an electric truck if there's nowhere to charge them. So I guess my question is there anything in this model that talks about infrastructure and the rate of infrastructure increases needed to achieve these goals?
That's not something that we have explicitly in the model, no, but it's clearly an important point that needs to be looked at.
And in terms of policy, the policy is mostly to invest in the charging infrastructure. I'm not sure that there's a policy that sort of requires chargers to be installed, but there are the various funding mechanisms to pay for their installation. But again, that's not a specific parameter in the model.
I'll just follow up on that and say that we need to make sure we see the bottleneck we see within the solar installation and siting of solar, that we've never taken care of the siting issue, and that's why we bottleneck on solar being implemented. I think you're going to see the same bottleneck if we don't have the current infrastructure in place. You're going to see the same bottleneck on the purchase of electric vehicles. So, I mean, we should try to learn from our mistakes within solar and not do the same thing with electric vehicles.
Yeah. Thanks, Colby. All right, I don't see any other questions right now. So I think, Alicia, you can keep going.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so just breaking down passenger service, it is declining over time from the VMT reductions that I mentioned. And then ZEV is accounting for about half of the vehicles by 2035. And yeah, so you can see here that electric vehicles are dominating. There's a little bit of hydrogen here. And that by 2030, nearly 25% of passenger car and truck service is from EVs. For freight service, the service is staying fairly constant, but we are seeing a lot of ZEVs coming in. And for this, we have about 18% being zero emissions by 2030. And then by 2035, we also have a little bit of hydrogen coming in. But again, hydrogen doesn't seem to be playing a big role for the near-term target. So for the building sector, we were getting about 33% emissions reductions, and that's through a combination of energy efficiency as well as electrification policies. We are getting more emissions reductions from the residential sector, and you can see in this chart here that gas is contributing to most of the emissions, although it is decreasing over time. So in our current policies, we have Empower, the Building Energy Performance Standards, as well as IRA tax credits and rebates. And then for this scenario, we layered on top of it the all electric construction standards starting in 2027, zero emissions appliance standards that are in line with San Francisco Bay Area standards. And we have also extended the energy efficiency standards from Empower so that they go beyond 2027. Okay, and looking at electrification in residential versus commercial buildings, it's definitely steadily increasing for both. And particularly for commercial buildings by 2035, there's less than 25% of the mix coming from fossil fuels. And if there aren't any questions for buildings, I'll pass it to Kathleen to talk about the industrial sector.
So one question come up regarding the are the dates for implementation of the Bay Area appliance standards the same as the Bay Area's regulation starting in 2027?
Yes, they should be in line with the start dates for the Bay Area.
Thanks. And Sandy?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, kind of related to the last slide on the electrification increase. Is that informed by grid improvements in any way, or is it just based on the policy of converting to more electric within our buildings? So kind of a similar question to what Colby was raising related to the electric vehicle component. Does the model assume that the grid will be able to support this level of deployment of electrification in buildings?
Yeah, so in our model, the building sector is linked to the electricity sector and the transport sector and so on. So this should all be supported by the grid.
Gary?
I was actually going to ask a really similar question about the extent to which the model models out all the costs that would be incurred to make this level of investment happen in buildings and in the associated transmission distribution infrastructure that we would need. Like, does the model end up yielding cost information about all of that? And I guess a slightly unrelated question, but I'll ask it right now too. You had talked earlier about an assumption that the RGGI standards for power plants goes to zero by 2040, I think it was. Did you look at, like, what if RGGI doesn't do that? So I think there's a very real chance that RGGI doesn't do that. Is there a way to express the assumption about what RGGI would do, which is outside of just Maryland's control? Is there a way to express it differently as a function of what would Maryland policy need to do to effectuate that same goal? Maybe that doesn't make sense. Sorry.
No,
Should
so
I-
so we will, in our final report, we will have some sensitivity runs, and that is definitely a policy we could look at, just like varying the Reggie cap and seeing what that means for Maryland.
Yeah, I think it'd be really, it'd be useful to say, like, what if Reggie only does a 40% reduction and then is unwilling to go there as a group? Is there still a separate way of expressing, is there still a policy move that the state of Maryland could make where we could still do X, differently than the rest of the Reggie states? And how does that change kind of how far we get? But what about this question on the cost piece? Like, does the model end up also telling us the investment we're making in buildings or in the transmission infrastructure associated with the assumptions that that the results we're seeing on the screen?
Yeah, so that's not a direct model output, but Steve, what do you think? Is that something that can be done post-process?
Yeah, we do track the end use part. And in fact, that information is going into a parallel part of the study to look at the jobs impacts, because that's that's a group we're collaborating with using a economic model to look at the jobs impacts. So they're taking their GCAM results and looking at that. So we do have, for example, the new purchases of equipment and so on. So that part of the cost we have and capital, and that's getting passed to them. We don't track expansion of infrastructure. So that is one limitation. So we're not really tracking that. We have to infer that. Clearly, if you think back to the slides on electricity, if we're expanding up our electric generation and use, that does imply some expansion of electric infrastructure. So we have to either look offline or find another tool or other studies to take a look at that. And I think Chris is going to address your other question.
Yeah, I think there may be two areas. Is one, like, so we should remember that this is the big umbrella economy-wide planning tool, right? There's still definitely critical need for all of our more targeted, specific studies and processes and policy-making consultations in this group, right? This tool isn't going to be able to replace, like, the deep dive on the impacts of an electrified grid that the PSC study is looking at, right? Or, specific targeting of EV infrastructure that's done by the ZEVIC, the Zero Emissions Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Council, and MDOT's NEVI planning, et cetera. So this is meant to be sort of take a step back and look at the entire economy. So there will be some limitations in this particular work output and this particular plan in terms of, like, really specific stuff, sector by sector. So we should definitely keep those sort of gaps in mind at this level of analysis to make sure that all of our more detailed processes are picking those up, or where there isn't a more detailed process for one, that we can make sure the MWG or some other arm of the Climate Commission or something can pick that up if it's a critical need. And then on the Reggie specific question, one part that will be for later iterations of the plan that we're still working through what the methodology will be is looking at individual policy impacts, right? Because we're supposed to talk about what, not just do what do all the plan as a whole, all the things in the plan as a whole accomplish, but what do individual policies accomplish? And the way you do that in a modeling framework is that you have your scenario with everything, and then you start just dropping out policies one by one. That's a lot of modeling, though. So that's not anything that can be in the June report. And we're looking at, what are viable and things that are manageable from a workload and modeling perspective, viable ways to include that policy level analysis, where the model will tell you, okay, what if we just don't do Reggie, but we do everything else? That sort of tells you, okay, what's the impact of Reggie individually? So that's to come later.
Yep, thanks.
And Brian?
Thanks. I think Chris actually just answered my question. Insofar as how you tease out the costs and impacts of each of the individual components that we're looking at, but just like sort of piggybacking on what Garrett was saying earlier, like if you're going to pull Reggie out and say, what else do you need to get there? Or rather, what does it cost to get there? I mean, this is a hypothetical, but you put, a carbon cap around Maryland just Maryland that it must meet, right? And it's encompassing all of the sectors or some collection thereof. It doesn't tell you specifically, I mean, you can compare against another scenario to see where the reductions come from, but it does tell you sort of like in a very crude way what the, emissions abatement cost is, right? For doing such a thing, right? If it looks like it's $400 a ton to do it that way, then that tells you that it's going to be really hard. If it's $5 a ton, it's a different matter. That's just one sort of way that we could sort of get at the question that I think Garrett was trying to answer.
Thanks. Alicia?
Maybe we can go on to the industrial sector now. Thanks. Yep. So the industrial sector, we do see achieving 62% reductions by 2031. And the key policies here are currently the IRA hydrogen tax credits and the 45Q credits for CCS. And we also include, layered on top of that, fuel switching from coal to natural gas by clean standards that would act to increase electrification, efficiency, and CCS. And we include the sector under the cap and invest backstop policy that Alicia mentioned in the initial slides. So I would just note here that these additional policies would require removing the manufacturing exemption that's currently included in the GGRA. And this is something we also found to be potentially beneficial in our manufacturing deep dive study from last year. So I did want to point that out again here. Next slide. This is the breakdown of fuel use for the industrial sector. And we see that it stays roughly constant overall over this period with an increasing fraction of electrification. And you may remember from our current policy scenario, we saw there that there was a growing fraction of fossil fuel use driven by increase in demand. So this constant overall level is a reversal of that trend. We do see biofuels and biomass playing a bigger role in later years, as well as a tiny bit of hydrogen coming in by 2035. And the coal decline that you see here is primarily due to coal to gas switching within the cement sector. And that is a current plan by the private companies. So we do include those private sector plans here. Next slide. This is the industrial processes and product use, or IPPU sector. And we see this achieving 48% reductions by 2031. A lot of these reductions come from the reduction in substitutes for ozone depleting substances, or ODS. And these decrease largely because of the federal AIM Act, as well as the Maryland-specific HFC regulations. Also included in the sector is, again, the 45Q tax credits and increasing availability of cement CCS. Next slide. And for the next couple of sessions, I'll turn it over to Cowan. Was the question?
Sorry, could you spell out what the HFC acronym means? That's not in my my database here.
Yeah, it's hydrofluorocarbons. So it's fluorinated gases that replace like CFCs in refrigeration, air conditioning, things like this.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cowan, if you're on,
yep,
you can.
I can take over now. Thank you. So turning to the fossil fuel industry, overall, we find that this sector could achieve a 26% emissions reduction by 2031. We estimate future emissions in this sector from two components. The first is a baseline projection in the absence of any direct policy action in this sector. And then the second would be potential reductions from policy action. So the baseline projection is determined by the change in Maryland's economy-wide natural gas consumption through 2050 in GCAM as a result of the other policies in the current policy scenario. So in that current policy scenario, we see a reduction in the near term, but this projection begins to tick upward in the 2030s as some of those policies affecting natural gas consumption in other sectors begin to expire. Also included in the current policy scenario is the existing methane regulations in Maryland, as well as small additional reductions from the IRA methane fee on 2 Maryland facilities that would potentially be subject to that fee. In the CSNA scenario, we find additional reductions relative to those in the current policy scenario that are driven by a further reduction in Maryland's economy-wide gas consumption across all sectors. And that reduction in the CSNA scenario is not from additional policy action in this sector. Can move to the next slide, please. For waste management, we find in this sector, we can achieve a 47% reduction. We first assume that from 2020 to 2050 for landfill methane, in the absence of any additional policies, that 2020 Maryland inventory emissions for landfills would remain constant due to the continued waste diversion efforts offsetting increased waste from a growing population. From there, in the current policy scenario, we assume the Maryland landfill regulations are in force, achieving reductions equivalent to the average of the minimum and maximum estimated reduction potentials in that regulations technical support document. And then in the CSNA scenario, we had assumed that the maximum estimated reduction potential would be achieved as noted in the technical support document for the landfill regulations. However, it was pointed out yesterday that there may not be specific action that the state could take to increase the probability that that maximum reduction potential is achieved. So this is an assumption that we'll probably have to revisit. And if potential reductions are sought from landfills, we could potentially look into additional waste diversion efforts. Got a question before we move on?
Yeah, go ahead, Colby.
Yeah, so this, I wanted to just make sure I understand on these reductions. So waste diversion, I'm assuming like pulling the compostables out and diverting those to more of a compost type option. Does this model look at what methane is lost through the composting process? And since that's an aerobic digestion process, so it's still through the breaking down process is going to produce a methane product. So how does that convert from a methane being produced in a landfill versus possible methane being done in a composting site?
Yeah, thanks for your question. As for how we calculate these, we don't do the waste methane within the GCAM model itself. We do that outside of it. And for the purposes of these scenarios, we're using the percent reduction estimates from the technical support document and the data in that document that the state put out for the landfill regulation. As for the interplay between methane from composting and such, if Steve is still on, perhaps Steve, if you could speak a little bit more to some of the biogenic methane stuff that you've been looking into.
Yeah, so there is a trade, and I think that's something, it depends on the composting technology as far as the amount of methane. So that's something that I think MDE or together with MDE we can look at. So my impression is it would be much less methane, but it certainly depends also whether it's anaerobic or aerobic composting there. Yeah. So I think that, yeah.
Well, my follow-up to that is I know at the very beginning of this presentation, you guys said specifically that you hadn't incorporated the sinks into it, which obviously switching from just a landfill waste to a compost that can now be used as an organic fertilizer and organic matter into the soil, that's going to improve soil health, which is going to increase that sink component that we talk about for greenhouse gas emissions. And so I guess I was just trying to figure out, since you haven't looped in the sink part, which was where I would say it would be a wash. I was just trying to figure out how you were assessing for that.
Right. Yeah, that's sort of more of the life cycle analysis. We haven't done that full circle yet. And actually, perhaps more importantly, if through composting you can reduce the use of nitrogen fertilizer, that would actually be an even more important benefit for tax because of the energy component of that, more on the large scale, even if that's not from Maryland specifically. So yeah, but I don't know that we have very good data in Maryland at this point on the use of the compost and where it's going. So if that were to increase, then that would be something perhaps this state can look into.
I'd probably look at the poultry litter model. It's the most close, dissimilar. It's used for the same type products.
Yeah, of course, that has its very specific. And actually, I think we talked before that it was a little unclear. It wasn't clear even if we had good data on the amount of composting today, period. So there's probably some data needs there going forward.
And I would also note for the sinks, even if we were able to calculate that, because the 2031 goal is gross emissions, we wouldn't be able to count it toward that goal. So it's a little bit, unfortunately, irrelevant to the 2031 discussion, at least.
But it is relevant, as Kathleen implied. It becomes relevant to the net zero goal further on.
Yes.
So I'm seeing some other hands. Just a quick note, we'll continue to take questions just from the MWG members for now, but I do expect that once we get through the slides, we'll have some time for members of the public to be able to ask some questions for the CGS team. Let's see, Sandy?
Yeah, just a question related to the waste management assumptions, I guess. Are they linked similarly to what I asked about the energy nexus with, transportation and the buildings? Are the assumptions in the waste management portion assuming any increase in landfill composition and associated methane emissions from the conversion of the fleets or from the decommissioning of other aspects? How involved is the model with the assumptions around conversion of the fleets and decommissioning of older model vehicles and such? Is that?
Yeah, that won't really affect the methane emissions. It could affect the landfill capacity depending on what happens there. But the methane emissions come from the organic components. So basically food waste, any wood, paper, and anything that contains carbon that can readily decompose, that goes into the landfill instead of being incinerated or otherwise diverted. That's basically the feedstock that feeds the methane emissions generation in a landfill. So it really
would be more associated with the operation. Well, I mean, from a methane standpoint, I get that. I guess the main question is more aligned with how does an increase in one area in terms of conversion from a certain type of activity and the waste product from that maybe ending up in a landfill impact the overall emissions associated with landfills, whether it's methane or whether it's from an operational standpoint for the equipment that they use.
Well, from methane, I don't think that would have a large difference. There could be some impact on operations, but note that this turnover, there would still be internal combustion cars on the road for quite a while in the used car market, for example. So essentially, you're looking at what's already happening in the system where, if a car gets totaled, it goes to a scrapyard, and then that scrapyard recycles the steel. So it's actually, for example, all the metal in these vehicles tends to go back into metal because that's what the recycling yards do with that. And then some fraction of that may end up as industrial waste, but that is relatively, the plastics and other parts of the vehicles And then those are disposed of as part of the industrial waste stream, which can go to landfills. I don't think we have a model. I don't think anyone has a model of say, the energy or operations associated with that, however. But that would, of course, decline with time as, you know, that vehicle fleet essentially ages out and more or less goes away in this projection.
Sandy's always bringing the tough questions. Thanks, Sandy.
Yeah.
All right.
Were there any others?
If there's no others, we can move on to the next slide. All right, so shifting to agriculture now, we find that in this sector, we could achieve a 9% emissions reduction. So we first assume that the livestock populations in Maryland would remain constant from their 2020 levels. So in the absence of any direct policy action, we would see emissions from 2020 to 2050 from the livestock portion of agriculture emissions remain constant. And this is the assumption that we use for the current policies scenario. Now, in the CSNA scenario, we assume that some small reductions are made from livestock methane emissions. And to estimate these reductions, we use the EPA's marginal abatement cost curves for livestock methane in Maryland. And we assume that only those reductions that are achievable at a cost of less than $0 per ton of CO2 equivalent are achieved. And these reductions in livestock methane would come primarily from reducing methane emissions from enteric fermentation in ruminants. So if there's no questions on agriculture, I would turn it back to Kathleen for the next slide.
So this is our last sector, looking at forestry and land use, and these are the sinks that we've been mentioning. So these are held constant at 2020 levels right now. And again, they are not relevant for the 2031 goal, but definitely very important for the net zero goal in 2045. And so we are planning to include an estimate of the forest sinks over time in our final version of the model. And that will come from an estimate of some experts here at UMD that work on this area. And the key policies that will be represented for this sector is just the Tree Solutions Now Act and the 5 million trees included as a goal there. Next slide. So here we're looking at a summary of the economy-wide emissions reductions as well as the sector-by-sector emissions reductions. And we see that all sectors do play a crucial role, of course, in reaching 60%, but the distribution is rather uneven across the sectors. So the largest reductions do come from the electricity sector at 89%. Transportation is fairly large reductions in terms of megatons of carbon, but relatively low as a percent compared to a few of the other sectors. And agriculture, as Callan just explained, does have fairly small percentage reductions, but it's also just a small sector overall. So that doesn't put as much of a burden on the other sectors to make up as if it were a large source to begin with. And in the next slide, we have, again, this breakdown, but now looking at megatons of carbon. And so you can see the contributions first of historical reductions that have already occurred as of 2020. And then we go sector by sector, the largest reductions coming from electricity, followed by transportation, and then buildings, all the way through to agriculture. And the lighter color blue is the reductions under current policies, and the darker color is the additional policies that we've layered on over top for this scenario. Next slide. So we wanted to provide a quick summary of some of the policies that we see as being particularly high impact within these scenarios. So we have both current policies and additional policies that we wanted to highlight. Under current policies, there's the 50% RPS, ACC2, ACT, and of course the BEPS, Building Energy Performance Standards, as well as natural gas methane. And then the additional policies that were particularly important, we found was the 100% clean energy standard by 2035, RGGI going to zero by 2040, the zero emission appliance standard for buildings, the VMT reductions in the transport sector from smart growth and mode switching, and finally the backstop cap and invest policy that did apply across all sectors. Next slide. So we wanted to end by briefly mentioning the sensitivity scenarios that will be running to get the variation around this core scenario that we've just showed you. So first, we'll be looking at a low estimate of the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we'll be giving that its own scenario to see specifically with a little bit less optimistic assumption, what does that do to our ability to meet the goal? And then we'll have a second scenario that looks more broadly at low implementation across both the IRA at federal level and other state policies. So this would be where we would incorporate things like the RGGI variation that was mentioned earlier, where we could look at if that doesn't happen, what is the impact on the ability to beat the goal? And finally, we can look at a difference in just emissions accounting, where we can say what happens if we are able to include sinks and look at a net goal for 2031 rather than the gross emissions goal. So that one's not any new policies or anything, just a little bit of a change in how we do the math. And with that, we can go to the next slide and stop, and happy to take any questions.
I saw one question I want to throw at you, and then we'll turn to you, Mike, regarding how the model accounts for with additional electrification of heating systems and the possibility of heat pumps potentially having HFC leaks. Does the model account for leakage rates of HFCs from air conditioning and heat pump systems? And is the move toward more heat pumps showing any increase in HFC emissions over time?
Alicia, do you want to speak to that one?
So maybe Steve can speak to what happens inside of the model, but for this project, we are using HFC assumptions from outside of the model. It's the USCA tool and the CARB tool. So it's not actually linked to the building sector that we're modeling here.
Yeah, and then we basically have national assumptions. We don't have a lot. Well, I don't think we have any Maryland-specific data other than sort of downscaled national projections or national estimates. The newer equipment is more efficient than the current stock of equipment. So, but you raise a point that we should make sure we've considered. So.
And I think as we're puzzling through that, so right now it mostly accounts for the phase out of HFCs under the state regulation that we promulgated, that was then shortly followed by the federal law, the AIM Act, and now the federal regulations phasing out high global warming potential HFCs in a number of applications, including refrigeration. But if we're trying to tie it to changes in stock, we also have to consider that if we're installing heat pumps in more homes in Maryland, just about almost all homes in Maryland already have air conditioning of some sort, right? So a lot of that is replacing a compressor with a heat pump. So it's not necessarily a material increase in the number of systems that are using refrigerants, right? It's using different ones that operate as a heat pump rather than solely a compressor. So it's an interesting thing to puzzle through. But right now we are largely incorporating the phase out of the chemicals under Maryland and federal regulations.
Thanks, Chris. Mike?
Yeah, I want to make sure we don't lose the forest for the very interesting and informative trees here. The last model run we had about if I remember, about a 14.2 million metric ton shortfall, preliminary numbers. Now, and you of course have a lot of assumptions that we can actually implement the policies that we've got, that the grid is adequate, that we can achieve the kind of penetration numbers for electric vehicles that you're predicting. But what you're basically saying is, if we successfully, I want to make sure I got it right, if we successfully implement all of those policies, we can achieve the 2030 number without any significant new policies. It's a matter of making sure that we do achieve the goals of those policies. Do I have that right?
No, we are including additional policies beyond what's currently on the books for this scenario.
Yeah, I should have said the CSNA policies that you have, that those would be sufficient.
Yes, so that's what the model shows, that these policies will meet the goal. That is, of course, something that we can look at with the sensitivity scenarios, as I mentioned, of if there isn't quite full implementation or if it's not quite as efficient as we would like in achieving all of those reductions, what is the downside of that and how much might you be risking in those policies?
Yeah, and I was approaching it primarily from our sort of workload. It's do we need to come up with a whole new set of scenarios, or do we need to make sure we know how to implement these scenarios and make sure they succeed? That was sort of where I was coming from.
Yeah,
Thank
I think
you.
a good way to think about this might be that these are the minimum necessary policies, and that anything else additionally on top of this could always help and be supportive. But this is what the model shows that you need at a minimum.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And I think we're interested in hearing, like, what are the questions that you guys want the sensitivity analyses to answer? Because as the CGS team mentioned at the top, where there's sort of one CSNA policy scenario being offered here that hits the 60% goal, rather than, we've been talking earlier in the process, we would have a bunch, right? We would have one that achieves it this way, one that achieves it that way. I think one of the initial conclusions from these preliminary results is that there really is not wiggle room. We don't have much flexibility to push a little bit harder in one sector and a little less hard in another, because there's just no slack with the goals being so strong. So in these sensitivity scenarios, just so that everyone's aware, where we may say this policy doesn't achieve its results or that one doesn't, the scenario is not going to hit the goal. I don't think that we're in a position where we can say, all right, what if we aren't able to break a solar logjam? How do we make it up elsewhere? Because we're running out of things elsewhere that could make up shortfalls anywhere. If you catch my meaning. So as everyone's thinking through and asking, like, hey, how should we shape sensitivity analysis and additional scenarios? I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that we don't have a lot of flexibility here based on what we're seeing from the analysis.
Well, I mean, two of the primary priorities we identified last year, obviously, is what if we don't solve the solar bottleneck, and therefore we don't get as much solar built in state as we expected. And secondly, whether we don't get the penetration level on electric vehicles that we expect, either because people are using the trade-ins to use the oversale of electric vehicles elsewhere, or people are holding on to used vehicles longer, or they're trying to import stuff from West Virginia. So I mean, those two items I think we had previously identified as the biggest sensitivity concerns about our ability to achieve the numbers.
Bob?
Okay, I'm unmuted. I have a question about the 45Q tax credits. Usually if you capture the CO2 in some form, you have to store it somewhere. And my question is, what type of storage are you thinking of in the modeling, and where do you think that will be done?
Steve, I know you've been looking at this. Do you want to answer?
Sure. Yeah. Well, as you know, most of the storage, most of the activities in Maryland are in the central part of Maryland. There's actually the best, unfortunately, the best understood and most accessible storage is in Western Maryland, but there's a minority of our operations there. So it would really be in the central and eastern parts. So some of those geologic storage options are better understood than others. There is a report that was done for Maryland MDE on this a couple years ago that I presume, I think they can make that can be made available to you. I suspect there's a link for it that someone has because they gave it to us. And so for some large facilities, they might be able to do storage, say, underground near their facility, which would be logistically not as complicated, if the finances are in place to allow them to do that. Whereas, for example, say the natural gas power plants that are primarily located sort of PG County and surrounding counties, there might have to be some sort of regional pipeline network to store CO2 if you wanted to do CCS there. So really, that question really depends on where the industry is, how you need to aggregate the CO2. For some industries, individual facilities might be large enough. For example, the large cement plant, that's large enough that they could potentially do that there in theory. Whereas other industries or plants, you would have to aggregate the CO2, and it's generally thought that would be a pipeline network, and then have an injection site to store it. So that's sort of the way that technology would work. And then the policy question is could that be implemented and feasible? And then there's there's natural gas power plants near the border of Pennsylvania. So that might be more of an issue of tapping into some, if there were ever a regional network for doing this. So it's really can be very site and industry specific in that way.
Thanks. Colby?
Thanks, Mark. I guess, this is, I've sat on the Chesapeake Bay water quality stuff for a long time. And I know in a lot of those remodels and things that we've done over time, a lot of time there's a lot of cost. What is the cost to reduce a pound of nitrogen in this practice or that practice or those? Has there been any kind of economic assessment of what the cost is to implement these programs, the future stuff, the additional projections that are needed, the additional policies that are needed to achieve these goals, so we have some sort of idea? I mean, it's good to have a goal, but we're moving into some kind of uncertain economic times, and we've got a education blueprint that is an absolute massive expense to the state. And I'm just trying to figure out what happens if there's not enough state funding, and where's the core things that need to be put in place, or the funding sources that need to be put in place to keep this train on the track if we do go into some uncertain economic times.
Yeah, you're right, Colby. We've got so sort of two different economic analyses that we are planning on doing, sort of a macroeconomic analysis and then more of like a funding plan analysis, leading to the final report in December. So there'll be a lot more on the costs and how to balance those costs as we go down the road here. Sandy?
Okay, just a quick question kind of related to that, Mark. What is the role of the Mitigation Working Group in terms of the sensitivity analysis and input to the UMD team? Are we is there a plan for that in terms of like our engagement, or is it something that is being handled separate from the MWG?
Yeah, we're living that live right now. So this is I think our fourth meeting with the modeling team for the MWG. So this is a fast evolving project, right? I think, as we mentioned before, when MDE developed the GGRA plan, there was a bit more time for the MWG to develop its own policy scenarios and for that to be modeled. Given the deadline that we're working to in the law, we didn't have that time to do MWG born policy scenarios. So instead, we're creating all of these check-ins for you to be hearing the modeling results essentially literally as fast as MDE is, so that we can all be on the same page about what are we hearing, what are we seeing, what reaction do we want to give to the modeling results, so that the CGS team can continue to improve the model as we work through this process. So the engagement is the good questions that you all are providing today, and we still have 20 minutes or so for this discussion with CGS.
And maybe to put a finer point on it, that list of sensitivity scenarios that was up on the screen just earlier, one of them about not some policies not being fully implemented, that was our interpretation of the input we received at the last meeting about the current policies case. And so if that's the direction, still the direction the MWG wants to go, yeah, it's going to be good to hear that confirmation or different directions so that the CGS team can get to work.
Garrett?
Yeah, and Chris, that's certainly still I would still hope that we're modeling sensitivities like that. Even though my main comment here is just thinking back to something that Chris said earlier. I very much buy the narrative that there's no option but to do the things that we've come up with. I mean, clearly the way I interpret the modeling exercise that we're doing here, we're basically saying the things we already thought of and decided we're going to do, even if they're still kind of high level, we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to do them, but we said we were going to do these things, plus a few other big ideas that we've modeled. What would the impact of doing that stuff be? This has not been an exercise to say, of all the different ways we could do all the different gazillion things, what's the very best optimal way to do it? Because as soon as we looked at the list of the things we've already committed to and the next few big ideas, it looks like it takes all of that to get to the goal. And we don't really have other really big ideas that we could do instead of these things. There's not an optimization exercise to do at that really high level. We got to do all the things. I very much buy that. When we've looked at, similarly at the county level, when I previously worked for City of Oakland in California, we did, very similar, like high ambition modeling exercise. We found the same thing. You run out of ideas before you hit the goal, and there isn't a whole set of other things you could have done instead to go compare it to. And I think it's not obvious to me that everybody will buy that narrative. Like we will kind of quickly realize how true that is. I think it's still important for us to be able to say, if we didn't do all of these things, what would the next 5 big ideas be that we would do instead? And they're going to be preposterous things. I mean, to some folks, some of the things on our list are already going to feel like they're preposterous things. And we're going to have to deal with that. And I think most of our work, as someone said earlier, it really needs to be unpacking the things that are on our list and figuring out what can we contribute to make it more likely that these things will get done, will get adopted. A lot of detail to play out, dozens of policies within some of the ideas that are on our list. But we still need to have some kind of frame of reference for, if we didn't do all the things on the list, what are we talking about? We're talking about retrofitting everybody's building across the state in this way. I mean, we're talking about nobody ever drives anymore. I mean, I think it's still going to be necessary to have some kind of narrative of what feels like what the alternative would have been for folks to start to get to some level of acceptance that indeed we got to do all the things that we've landed on here. And I do think that this group should be part of kind of figuring out what that is, even if we accept that we shouldn't try to endlessly play out completely different scenarios than what's on the list, because that might just not be worth the time.
Yeah, and you all, above all, are probably not terribly surprised with the things that wound up in the model and the modeling results, because a lot of these things are recommendations from the Climate Commission, right? You all have already voted in favor of all electric new construction standards and zero emissions appliance standards. Some of the things that CGS is now, confirming. Well, the Climate Commission had some good ideas there. Those are effective at decarbonizing, buildings in that case. So you have a lot more insight to the background and the value of these policy measures than the rest of the public. And of course, one of the tasks ahead is that MDE and partner agencies and our partners at CGS this summer, July, August, and into September, will do a bit of a roadshow around the state and discuss these modeling results and discuss the policy implications. And you're right, Garrett, to flag that these are some hard conversations to have. And I think maybe comparing these hard decisions with alternative hard decisions is a good way of framing things as we head into those meetings. Kim?
First of all, thank you, University of Maryland, for some great work. And I have to admit I was a little bit surprised that we got there. Like, if we do all the policies plus a little bit and we do it all perfectly, we'll get there. Because I actually didn't think that was true. So that's good, I guess. I'm gonna just echo what Garrett said and point out to Chris that yes, I really believe we have to look at the less than 100% compliance scenario. We're not going to get there. We're not there now. We're not projected to get there, and human nature is going to sit in a big way, and fiscal responsibility is going to sit in a big way. So I want to keep that on the table for sure. That sensitivity analysis of less than 100% compliant with these policies is really, really a critical question. And then also going to the point that Mike made earlier about where we're headed with this, the decision makers, i.e. our elected officials, are going to have to figure out what's next. How do we get to 100% compliant? What kind of state resources is it going to take, or what other state laws are we going to have to put in place? So as we're looking at this, I hope we have, the file over here that is keeping track of those really important recommendations that we've got to move forward with. And I'm certain number one's going to be revenue. So.
I agree with you. I mean, examples are, we know that we've got to have more utility scale solar, but saying we need it and that we plan to have it is whole different than how do you get there. We know we've got to have a lot of electric vehicles on the road, but passing a law that says we're going to have sales of electric vehicle and actually getting them on the road is a financial difference. I completely agree with you. We can't assume that, okay, the model says this and therefore we're done.
Well, we couldn't agree more. A lot of our focus, of course, is thinking about how do we implement these bold policies. So that's I'd say the primary focus for MDE currently. Other questions or comments while we have CGS here with us? Well, they'll be back next month. I can't let them get away from us. So, as described earlier, there'll be a few sensitivity runs on this core CSNA policy scenario. They'll be back in about 4 weeks from today to share those results. Soon thereafter, the compilation basically of all these results will be presented in the Pathways report, which is due at the end of June. And again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Pathways report is the primary tool that we're using for our public outreach for the rest of the summer to get input from the public from Western Maryland to the Eastern Shore on these possible conceptual policies to achieve Maryland's goal. Yeah, Garrett.
Just real quick on there have been a couple places where we've heard about policies that questions have come up, like what exactly does that one mean? And I'm thinking, there was a note about an extension of Empower. What are we talking about as assumed there, or that MD will develop electric appliance standards similar to Bay Area? It would be really useful to me to be able to see the 1 or 2 lines that would go underneath each of those policies that say quantifiably what kinds of assumptions we're making. So like that, the appliance standards one, we're assuming that this would become the standard. It would begin in this year, and we're applying it to however many percent of the new appliance purchases per year. Is there a document somewhere? Will that be in the Pathways report, I guess, or is there some other internal thing that folks on the committee would be able to see just to get our heads around the details that are meant by some of the policies that we just saw?
Yeah, so that will absolutely be in the Pathways report. We'll have some information about that in the main text and also a detailed technical appendix with all of the modeling assumptions and specific policies written out. So, Cowan, did you have something else to say there? Okay.
Yeah, and we weren't able to get the presentations posted beforehand, but we'll certainly be posting today's presentation on the website after the meeting. Other questions, comments from the modeling team?
Just a big thank you. I think they've done it's outstanding work here.
Agreed. Go Terps. Okay, well, I guess you all get off the hook a few minutes early. That's more, billable hours for us to use in other ways. That's good stuff. So let's see, going next to the agenda, I think that I wanted to turn things over briefly to Michelle Dietz, if she's here, to talk about the scope of work. Hey, Michelle. For the phase 2 study that TNC is funding for Energetics and VEIC to continue their work in support of our effort to think about what the state's support should be for accelerating the equitable adoption of ZEVs, zero emission vehicles, light duty in the state. So, Michelle, do you want to tell us a little bit about the scope of work for this next phase? Oh, you know what, Michelle? I saw that you unmuted, but we can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
Sorry about that. Well, thank you guys for the time today to be able to just share a little bit more. I know that we've had Energetics and VEIC on some previous calls, so just wanted to circle back with everybody and share a little bit more about this phase 2 project. So VEIC and Energetics came on, I think it was in our March and our April meetings, to share more about our phase 1 project. And after working with them, we realized that we wanted to dig in a little bit deeper into the potential policy framework ideas that they had shared with us in that first report out. And so our phase 2 scope of work really looks at program and implementation design, and we're focusing in on dealer engagement, technical support for fleet conversion, and incentives and initiatives targeting the used car markets and low-income buyers. And so we're doing this in conjunction with our partners in state agencies, with Mitigation Working Group partners. So we've had our first kickoff meeting with several folks on this call and state agency partners to make sure that we're asking the right questions, bringing the right folks into the conversation, considering all of the great expertise here and the ongoing project work like what we just heard about, to make sure that there's this collaboration happening. The scope 2 or phase 2, the scope of work is on a shorter time frame, and that's a TNC need. Our end of fiscal year is June 30, so we have to spend the money that we're using for this by then. So it is a short timeline. I know we've had our first meeting. We should be having our second follow-up meeting in the next few weeks here, and a final wrap-up by mid to late June, and a final report out by the end of June. And Energetics and VEIC are planning on joining us to report out to the Mitigation Working Group on these findings and being able to share a little bit more about how these programs could potentially work within the structures we have in our state agencies and ongoing work here. So we're excited to work with VEIC and Energetics again. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or if I'm not the right person, to field them with our staff. So I also just share that Kate Kerr from the Nature Conservancy is our project manager for this work as well, and she's not able to join today, but either myself or Kate can help to answer questions here. So I'll pause there. Any other context, Mark, you want me to share?
No, I think we could just turn to any questions for Michelle or her team. Yeah, Colby.
Yeah, so question for your, I'm assuming that you're targeting a specific sector of the state for the advancement of EVs. What, outside of the cost of an EV, what are the major impediments that are preventing your targeted audience to purchase?
So I think we're looking into a variety of different barriers. So I'm happy to report out on what those might be. And I think we might have included some of those in the first phase as well. And there will be, and if this is helpful too, to share this scope of work, I'm happy to do that as well. We will be doing a few stakeholder conversations and interviews to get some more details and information from potential consumers on what those barriers are, aside from cost. But other considerations are the locations of charging stations, access to those in communities. So we're looking at multiple different potential barriers for purchasing and access.
Thank you.
And Michelle, you might have said it. Sorry if I missed it. We can expect a report out from Energetics and VEIC for the MWG sometime this summer. Remind me, what month are we targeting?
Sure. So the project wraps up by June 30, but I'm expecting they might take a little bit of time to pull together any final materials. So we are happy to bring them on board for a July, August meeting, whatever works best for the Mitigation Working Group's agenda and schedule. So just let us know what's best for you guys.
Great. Thanks. Any other questions or comments for Michelle? Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I just want to report on observations I have about living in Rockville. All our recreation centers have up to 3 chargers, and they aren't generally used. We have some, I'll use the word malls, used to refer to them as strip malls, very small, okay? And they have chargers, and they don't seem to be heavily utilized. What I read and what I hear is that most people are using their electric vehicle to drive around town or short ranges, and so they do their charging at home. So I'm assuming at the moment I'm left with the bias that most people are charging their electric vehicle at home. Where I see the challenge, and I think would be helpful, is where we're looking at multifamily rental units, and there's just not a lot of space to get a charger in. So even if you found incentive for them to buy the car, okay, they still have the challenge of how do they charge it at home. So I think in your work, if you would look at multifamily units, and they are sometimes very limited for space, but to figure out some scenario that would allow you to put charging lots near that building so that they could not only, let's say, be helped in buying the car, but now they see a solution as to, I can charge at home just like everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Bob. And that's definitely been a consideration that we've been talking about, and the equitable access to those type of vehicle charging stations for renters or folks that live in multi-unit housing complexes. How do we ensure that Marylanders across the state can access those if we're really pushing for a rollout of electric vehicles across the state? So thank you for that.
Great. Well, thank you, Michelle, for that update.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I see 2 people have signed up for public comments. If there are others who'd like to make public comment, feel free to put your name in the chat, or otherwise you can unmute now and tell me that you are interested in making a public comment. And I see Mariah, you're first up, so go ahead.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share today. My name is Mariah Schreiner. I am the Climate Campaign Representative for the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, speaking today on behalf of Climate Partners. So I know Josh Tolkien has shared more about Climate Partners on previous Mitigation Working Group calls. So just for review, Climate Partners is a coalition of dozens of environmental, faith, and justice-focused organizations working across the state to achieve a clean energy future. So together we are working to advance strong implementation of the Climate Solutions Now Act, and specifically to bring forward strong recommendations from our communities on what a meaningful and equitable climate plan will look like for the state. So we were very excited to hit our first major milestone and submit our preliminary priorities to MDE on May 15th, which included sector-specific recommendations for transportation, electricity generation, and buildings, as well as overarching equity recommendations. These priorities were developed in strong collaboration with our organizations and networks and endorsed by 34 members of the Climate Partners. I will share the 15-page preliminary priorities letter in the chat, and recognizing that we don't have time right now, I won't dive into specific policies on the call right now, but just want to share that Climate Partners is happy and excited to talk more about our recommendations with the MWG as a whole or with individual members later. And you will be hearing from us again in future calls as we share more about our progress on our own reference case modeling with the Center for Climate Strategies and also our full climate plan later in the summer. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And yeah, we're reviewing the ideas that you submitted. I saw a number of overlapping ideas with Climate Commission recommendations. So I think, again, strong reinforcement that we've had some good conversations over the last couple years on sensible pathways to achieve Maryland's goals.
Yeah, if I can just one follow-up request to Brian and the group. One of the things that we've been talking a lot about is funding for the policies, and to the extent that your group could make recommendations on that, because I think at the end of this month, my prediction is this group is going to be making some recommendations on what they think the General Assembly should do on the budget side. And it's not a direct policy proposal, but it may be a crucial issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, funding is definitely an important piece of this, and I'll bring that back to the rest of the group.
Thanks again, Maria. And I see Jeff Silva. Jeff, go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you very much. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Thank you very much. I'm sending a link right now. And as it turns out, now let me find what I was trying to say. Okay. Well, basically, I've spent some time looking at the Pathways to Maryland's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Goals slideshow by Maryland School of Public Policy from the last session, mitigation session. And here we are. I'm glad to see that we've continued on. But referring to that last presentation, I saw on the slide number 11 that the passenger service by mode graph shows that the portion of large cars and trucks dominate each of the graph's columns. So it's each of those years, our trucks and SUVs happen to be the major component of the vehicles on the road. In slide 21, without the CSNA, we still overshoot by 14 million metric tons, and of reduction that we need to achieve. And transportation only reduces its CO2 by 38%, not 60% as necessary. Continuing on, in the slide 22, titled Remaining Emissions for 2031, showing the importance of small sectors, transportation in Maryland continues to be the largest source of our greenhouse gases, as shown in the columns. Then if that's the case, then most of the blame for Maryland's greenhouse gases should be placed on the owners of the large cars and trucks because of their low miles per gallon. According to the Washington Post article, the real reasons trucks have taken over the U.S. roadways, and the link to it is there in the text or chat box. Pedestrian deaths rose drastically when truck use increased because of their high frontal surface and increased weight. SUVs average 24 miles per gallon and trucks average today 19 miles per gallon. Those vehicles need to cut their emissions just like other vehicles on Maryland roads. If drivers are going to pay $50,000 to use an EV to end their addiction to oil and obtain reductions to greenhouse gases while living in America, then truck and SUV drivers need to shoulder the CSNA efforts as well as, or they should be paying for their indulgence. For the immediate public safety and the future of successful reductions of greenhouse gases, Maryland should double or triple annual registration fees on such vehicles as the large SUVs and trucks. People with such fragile egos that compel them to own opulent vehicles should pay a tax that matches the size of the vehicle. They burden others in their avoiding the public hazard that's placed in the public roads or public spaces by these opulent vehicles and put us at risk of their compensating for their fragile egos. Taxing their immature response to their fragile psyche will end the race to occupy the most public indulgence and stop their vain enjoyment they feel by damaging our climate corrective actions. We have to do something to level the burden. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, we thought we were going to hear funding ideas in future meetings, and there we go. Are there any other members of the public that would like to make public comment today? Well, in truly unprecedented form, on the decision of the co-chairs, I suppose we could end. Oh, Colby, you threw a wrench in the work. All right, Colby, what is it?
Sorry about that. I just wanted to wait and let any of the public have a chance to speak. I'm just be real brief. This will actually be my last MWG meeting. I've actually taken a career pathway change that's moving me to Texas, and I'll be leaving in mid-June for that. So this will be my last one, and we're working internally to determine if we wait until my replacement is selected to be my replacement on this committee, or if we bring somebody internally that's currently on staff. So just wanted to make that. I wanted to wait till the very end and let you guys know I really appreciate this open forum and this consensus building committee that's that we've had, and a lot of us come from different pathways trying to achieve the same goals. And I really appreciate the perspective and the department and the different departments to see that agriculture a lot of times is the square peg trying to fit in the round hole, and it's just really very, very difficult for agriculture to meet some of the goals that we want to have. And you know, this committee's done a great job of understanding that agriculture is doing a lot of things, and water quality and air quality BMPs go hand in hand. And so again, I thank everybody for that. The two co-chairs are outstanding, and that the staff here are really, really top notch. So thanks again for everybody's help, and keep agriculture in your mind. We're going to need all the help we can get. There's not many of us left.
Colby, Maryland appreciates your service. You will be missed.
We're really going to miss you, and you've been a great help to this. And please send us a picture of you in your new 5-gallon hat.
Will do. My Texas boots and my big hat.
And the belt buckle. Don't forget the belt buckle.
Very good.
Congrats, Colby. We're sorry to hear it, but happy for you. And yeah, send us a postcard from Texas. All right. If there's no additional business for the MWG, then co-chairs, are we adjourned?
So we're adjourned.
We're adjourned.
Wow.
Good job, everybody.
early. I
Thanks,
mean,
everybody.
take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.